Okay, so like Trisha and Polly, they like really talked about like the whole um climate aspect of things, and like obviously I'm going to be talking about that too because this is a climate seminar, but I'm also going to be bringing up a more economic aspect of I'm going to be bringing up the economic aspect, and I'm going to be taking into consideration the current situation today, so basically COVID-19. And I'm going to be talking about bailouts. Yeah, next.
Sorry, Harsimar, you're not on like the top panel. Is your camera not on, or is it just my computer that's or
Wait,
devices?
I
Oh,
think.
okay, you're just on the next one. Okay, okay.
Oh, okay, cool. Um, so a bailout, we're going to define that first. A bailout refers to an industry, a country, or a corporation which is on the brink of bankruptcy or failure, and it results in financial aid for said enterprises. And typically, government-funded bailouts come in the form of loans and grants. And I'm pretty sure that most of us know what loans and grants are, but I'm going to go ahead and define it real quick here. So loans have to be paid back. And in the context of bailouts, they usually have an extremely small amount of interest given the economic circumstances, but there's also usually a significantly generous amount of grants. And that essentially means that there's plenty of money that corporations and industries get and they don't have to pay them back. To better understand, next. To better understand how bailouts work and to create a reference which shows us the enormity of like the whole economic crisis that we have going on with corona, I think it's first important for us to refer back to the 2008 economic recession, which up until now was the largest economic crisis since the Great Depression, which was in the 20th century. So the bailout in so yeah, so the economic crisis in 2008 focused on primarily bailing out banks and really focused on Wall Street, which was honestly that was super ironic considering that Wall Street was the reason that the 2008 recession even happened. But that's like a totally different conversation. The oil and airline industries back then, they were not as prominent, but they still received a ton of financial assistance. The economic policies in regards to the bailouts was called the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008, and it allowed for the $700 billion it's for the $700 billion Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, and that had a 1% interest rate. So like I mentioned before, bailouts loans really have really low interest rates, and this was like astronomically low because not only is 700 billion like a crazy huge amount, the interest rate for these bailouts was lower than it had been in 45 years. Then okay, next. So the 2008 bailout program, which had been considered like crazy back then, it was trumped by the CARES Act, which is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. And the initial amount that it approved for bailouts and economic stimuli was $2.2 trillion. And for bailouts given in the form of loans, Trump ordered a 0% interest rate. So I mean, like, even if you don't look at the big huge chart that has like the two bars and shows that the coronavirus was way bigger, I mean, like, even just listening to all that, I think it's kind of obvious that the economic crisis we're in right now is just a little bit more problematic. Now, at the moment, some of the biggest candidates for bailouts are the rapidly sinking oil and airline industries, which again is ironic because these industries are also primarily responsible for the use of fossil fuels and carbon emissions. Next. So Airlines for America is an airline industry group that represents major carriers like United, American, and Delta, and they've asked for a $54 billion bailout, and this request included $29 billion in grants, which again is money that they do not have to pay back, and $25 billion in loans and tax breaks, which again has a 0% interest rate. So obviously we're not a big fan of this because not only will this money supply an industry that has shown practically no effort to evolve and stand for climate action. It's also an industry that has spent years in tax evasion, and they've been given a $1.5 trillion tax cut in 2018, and they've spent billions of dollars reinvesting in their own stocks and basically buying them back. So, like, if you take a look at it, what they're basically trying to do right now is exploit taxpayers and their money, and that's the only thing that is going to be preventing them and the whole industry from sinking. And so the largest perceived problem with this right now is that if we allow this industry to drown, it's going to take millions of jobs and a huge chunk of the economy with it, regardless of how bad it is for climate change and climate action. Next. So another industry that is nearly as problematic, if not more, is the oil industry. And I know, like, Trisha, she just like went through this and she just explained the whole effects of like oil corporations and like fracking and everything. But there's also like a bunch of other like negative effects that are like pretty basic, and I'm pretty sure we already know them. So I'm just gonna go ahead and quickly reiterate some of them. So we're already all like aware of the basic problems with like oil and fossil fuel industries. We know that they cause like air pollution, water pollution. We know they perpetuate environmental injustice. They have unethical labor and worker policies. And much like the airline industry, they have been raking in tax breaks and following systemic tax evasion. And if you read any of the stats that I've put on the slides over here, you can see that for like each of the like the topics that I mentioned, like air pollution, unethical labor, or tax evasion, there's like a stat for each of them. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here because that's not really the point of this this segment, but it's like basically like you should, like, if you don't already know, you should know that oil industries just really suck, I guess. So next. This pandemic has come an unprecedented collapse in the demand for oil, and storage facilities are full, and oil corporations are unable to find new places to put the oil that they're continually drilling, which actually they're not continually drilling because now they're basically being forced to stop their oil production and their distribution, and they have to lay off their workers. So simply put, much like the airline companies, the oil industry is also in a huge ton of trouble. And our current presidential administration has attempted to grant like swift relief to the struggling industry, but they've been faced with strict opposition from many of the Democratic Party. Nevertheless, the passing of the CARES Act has basically allowed Trump to potentially give the oil industry a projected $13 billion. Here is the thing though, much like the oil and gas industry and like the airline industry, the renewable energy industry, which is actually, there is still a fledgling, but they're also facing significant job losses. And despite our dear president claiming that he is an expert on wind energy, there seems to be a trend of continued disdain and hostility towards wind and solar companies and their workers. And the effort to bail out the oil industry does not seem to have transferred when it comes to the renewable energy industry. But again, we all already know that. So really there's no point in me reiterating this. So the question then becomes, what do we do about this and how do we fix it? Next. How can we create an upward trend in climate action and stop these fossil fuel industries while preventing a complete economic blackout and or repercussions that would last for decades? Next. So economically speaking, as unfair and as exploitative the oil industry is being right now of taxpayers, bailouts might just be the best solution to save these industries economically. But at the same time, if we do so, we're leaving the renewable energy industry to fend for itself. And as environmentalists, that is the most important thing we have going for us right now. And that's basically just not a viable option. That is not something that we can allow. Therefore, many environmentalists and economists have actually suggested that allowing the oil industry to bankrupt might be our best option, because right now the oil industry, they employ like these really old and unwanted policies, and we don't like them, right? So it's time for the oil industry to adapt. So yes, this would cause bankruptcies and debt write-offs for many corporations, but at the same time, it would also reduce financing costs for those left standing. And the only corporations that would be left standing would be those who merged with the renewable energy industry. And that would create a new era of sustainable and clean energies, which really is what we've all been trying to work towards. Obviously, the initial economic impacts of these would be really, really terrible, because there are so many workers that are dependent on the oil industry right now. And so laying them off would create serious economic impacts. But the ideal solution for this would be that we use the projected bailout funds, which was the $13 million for the oil industry, and we use it as stimuli for the workers, and that would help keep the economy intact. And then eventually, over a long-term timeline, the sustainable energies industry would be able to expand and create millions of jobs, which would be taken on by the workers that were laid off from the oil industry. Next. So a similar approach has been thought out for the aviation or the airlines industry, and some people believe that the best idea would have been to allow the aviation industry to consolidate their assets basically and like deal with bankruptcy. And this is like a really popular idea, given that the airline industry, like these companies have done it before, and they've done it time and time again, actually. So that's like the whole thinking behind this. They've done it before and they can do it again. And according to this model, there would be a temporary dip in the number of jobs lost, so like a temporary economic decline, but over an eventual time period, the industry would recover on its own and be able to create its own economic safeguards without having to rely on the government and resultantly on the billions of taxpayers' dollars. And in all honesty, this sounds like a good plan, but the only problem is that there's nothing in this plan that has to do with climate change. There's no motivation for these industries once they get back, or for the airline industry once they get back on their feet, to try and deal with climate change as a problem and to take climate action. So like, while it sounds like a really good scheme, and it honestly correlates really well with the projected solution for the oil industry is, the biggest problem, like I just said, is that it doesn't address climate change. Therefore, there's a highly supported and well-researched proposal from the Oxford Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, and their plan is that we allow these airlines a number of grants contingent on them enacting new climate change policies and creating a plan to transfer renewable energies, such as creating a requirement to have like net zero emissions by 2050, as well as intermediate 5 or 10-year targets. And if the airlines are unable to meet these targets, bailout funding would be converted to equity at today's very low stock market spot prices. So this would also force them to work more closely with the renewable energy industry, and this would also generate more revenue for the renewable energy industry, which would overall just boost and expand the sustainable energy industry. And that is an industry that we can all get behind. And obviously, when I'm talking about these two solutions, I'm definitely oversimplifying them. Like, I'm definitely oversimplifying the solutions a little bit, because this isn't something that could be enacted just that quickly. There's a ton of kinks that would have to be worked out, but I'm just trying to explain the basic gist of these proposed solutions. And both of these solutions, like, I haven't come up with these are solutions that have been researched and thought out by experts and economists, and they have really high public support. Like, a lot of people, like, if you look at the graphic down below, there is this, like, right now everybody's freaking out about corona, but at the same time everybody agrees that we cannot just be thinking about the short term, and that we have to realize that climate change, just because coronavirus has come in, climate change hasn't gone anywhere. So we still have to keep thinking about it, and we still have to think about the long-term effects and what we're going to be doing about it.